Hey, Ryan.
Hey.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right. How you doing?
I'm doing well.
Good, good. All right, so this is the first time you've done an Instagram Live, right?
I mean, is that the first question? This is already difficult.
um, Try not to worry about the enormous number of comments that'll fly by in a screen. They're very distracting. But I'll keep track and I'll try to sort through the interesting questions and things like that come up.
Yeah,
All
you
right.
got it. You got it.
Okay, so hi everybody. Thanks for joining us. Here with Ryan Brown, who is the author of the wonderful book Dear Coffee Buyer. It's a guide to buying green coffee. Ryan, I'd love to know a little bit about you and about your career that you could share with everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. I worked in coffee for a very, very long time, and I say worked because I am not currently employed or on the salary or payroll of any coffee companies. But I think that's why we're all here today, right? This is just a very large job interview, I hope. Um, and I worked at Pete's Coffee. I worked at Ritual Coffee in San Francisco. I worked at Stumptown. Most of my career was spent as a coffee buyer, and I transitioned into doing digital product stuff, and that's what I've been doing for the past few years. As soon as I left coffee, I wrote Dear Coffee Buyer, which I feel like is a good indication that I can't really leave coffee. You can't really get out.
I never wanted you to leave, so I'm glad you may come back one day. So, all right, wonderful. Well, we have a ton of questions and topics that people submitted, and we talked a little bit about covering some aspects of the book. Um, so I don't know. Do you have anything particular that you want to begin with? Because I could just pick some random questions if you'd like.
I'm looking forward to questions.
Okay.
Now that I've spilled all of my guts in Dear Coffee Buyer, let's hear
Okay.
the questions.
So one of the questions that came up is, what does building a healthy and long-lasting partnership with a co-op organization or single producer look like?
Mm, yeah. Um, I mean, if it's healthy and long lasting, it's like a friendship. Um, I'm guessing the question is kind of like, how do you do that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that was the implication is you're a green buyer. How do you form this healthy and long-lasting connection with a supplier?
Yeah. So if you're in coffee, you have customers. So I think a good way to start is to think about some of your favorite customers because you're a customer to your suppliers. And I think that for any good business relationship, you need to be very honest with yourself about what it is that you're buying and what it is that you want and what it is that you can buy. I think you need to be very honest with yourself about what sorts of qualities you're looking for and how much you're willing to pay. And I say these, and I don't mean them in any condescending way. I think that's harder to do than it initially sounds.
Yeah.
And then you need to be honest with your suppliers about those things as well. So the best relationships I had were typically with suppliers where we communicated frequently. We would text each other. We would Facebook message each other. We send Instagram chats with each other to this day, years after I've stopped buying coffee. And we communicate about our lives, and we also communicate about what's new and what's going on.
Mhm.
So I say it in the book, and I'll say it again here: be a good communicator, respond clearly, respond fast, um, and be honest with yourself and be honest and open with them.
I remember one of the interesting points you made in your book was that several times you effectively stole coffee supplies from other buyers who just weren't being communicative with the people at source, and that's I mean that's business and that's realistic, and I think it's great for the suppliers that they had you out there communicating relentlessly, because that's got to be scary if you're a supplier and you're like, all right, I have this coffee, it's going to age, it's going to lose value, I really need to move this coffee, I need to hear from the people on the other end.
Yeah, well, yes, thank you. I want to be clear too. There was nothing malicious involved
Right.
here. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone else. I was
Of course.
I was trying to help a producer who had labored to produce a special lot of coffee. And it's very easy, I think, to think of coffee farmers as just the good coffee that they end up with at the end of a harvest is like due to terroir and due to circumstances that were not intentional or deliberate. Coffee farmers, the most of the coffee that you get at great coffee shops, the coffee farmers put intention in, and by intention I mean they spent their money on extra and higher quality inputs, fertilizers, food for the coffee trees. They sent their best coffee pickers to the trees for that lot. They put a lot of time and money into producing that very great coffee. And then for you, dear coffee buyer, to just go silent at that moment is terrifying to them, because they've spent, years and on that specific coffee, 9, 10 months getting it ready, and then you're suddenly not picking up the phone, or you're, the figurative phone.
Yeah.
And so I was there to help them with that situation.
Sure. I like that chapter 4's heading is the importance of being responsive and crystal clear. Like I love that is, this unexpected chapter title for a book about buying green coffee. And I think, you're relentless about communicate, and that can't be said enough, because God knows how you communicate with someone in another country with a different culture who you may not share a common first language. They may not have, ready access to the internet all the time or whatever. And somehow you're supposed to keep constant communication and make sure that they feel comfortable and you feel comfortable and everything's done honestly. Like that's a lot to overcome,
Yeah, overcome is a great way to describe it. You're overcoming that you are, in most cases, you are coming from a completely different world from them. And you're hoping that they trust that you'll still be there when it's time for you to, to show the money.
Yeah.
Not actually, don't ever actually do that. But it requires that you build trust and confidence in that relationship. So
Yeah.
it's worth noting that a lot of coffee professionals have found interesting paths into coffee, and there's not necessarily an obvious kind of educational path into coffee, even to coffee buying. You know, yeah, I'll stop there. So a lot of times coffee is one of your first few professional working experiences, and prompt, fast communication is maybe not an apparent skill or advantage that you have to offer, but you do, and it's not something that anyone can really do better than you can. There's no good reason to not just respond quickly and promptly and clearly in emails.
So something tangential to this theme that really surprised me when I read it. I thought, I never would have thought this, but it's a really good point. I'll quote what you wrote. You wrote, "Introduce your competitors to your suppliers." You said, "Yes, that's right. And sure, you might think that's crazy, but I can't think of anything more imperialistic than keeping your suppliers reliant on you and your business. Besides, good suppliers who call you friend and partner should be able to look to you to connect with other buyers." And I think, amongst all this talk of like, oh, these people are our partners, our friends, and all this marketing around, look how close we are to our farmers. And it's like, yeah, you're right. If you're really friends, then why not introduce them to your competitors? But tell me a little bit about that. Like that's amazing that you took that attitude.
This is an onion with many layers. So I want to start by saying that, I'll try to keep it brief, but this will definitely spill into, I imagine, other things we'll talk about today. The best relationships with coffee producers that I've had are the ones who I've also introduced to my competitors, and my competitors bought their coffee. And guess what? The world did not end. It was fine. My competitors were also selling the coffee. It was marketed in a different way. It was not a bad thing. Because I had introduced them, I became better friends with my competitors, which was healthier for me. When your coffee buyer, you might think that your coffee buyer just has a decision between you or sending their coffee far, far, far away from you. But the real decision that coffee producer might be making is, should I continue planting coffee with all of the the diseases and illnesses and production implications of climate change, they might be looking at planting something entirely different.
Sure.
They might be thinking about just ending doing specialty coffee altogether. Introducing your supply chain to your competitors is the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do because you're helping to make sure that they continue to have a healthy and long-lasting relationship with you when you do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's keep them in business and keep them in specialty if that's, a good place for them to be. Awesome. So, okay. Let's move on to this because this is something that I have a lot of clients who are relatively new roasters and they're buying very small quantities of green. So
Yeah.
some of them may not even have sample roasters. All of them are probably relatively naive green coffee buyers. They're not necessarily, sure how to score coffee. They kind of just, a lot of them just trust their importer to tell them what to buy, which is, a little risky. What's your advice to beginners about, how do you approach sampling, dealing with suppliers? How many suppliers should you use? How many origins should you be buying? I mean, it's if you're just buying, 500 pounds a week or something like that, you don't have economies of scale. You can't use 7 different producers for 7 different origins. So how do you get started? What should these people be doing rationally?
Yeah. So if I were starting a roastery tomorrow, despite having worked directly with hundreds of producers, I would 100% rely on importers to get started.
I'm glad you said that.
That
Yeah.
now that does not mean that I would trust what the importer said about what to buy. These are
Yeah.
very different things. Importers are an incredible resource that you should avail yourself of, but that doesn't mean to just buy what they tell you to buy. It means that they're kind of approaching, for the most part, most importers are approaching what they buy agnostically. They'll buy something for everyone. It's the way that importer businesses do well, especially as they scale to be bigger importing businesses.
Mm-hmm.
So you should be cupping with them, and you should get a good understanding of what they like and how they score those coffees. And then you should calibrate yourself against them, and you'll learn that certain people at certain importers feel this way about naturals or washed Ethiopia or whatever it is, and you feel a different way. But that's kind of irrelevant. The important thing is that you're also communicating with them about what you're looking for, what you thought of what they're sending you. You should cup those. So that's like, I want to start with that is for God's sakes, like, use importers. They're an incredible resource when you're getting started.
Yeah.
And it'll make your life so much easier because the coffee's there, you're not waiting for it. If you do really want to buy coffee directly from certain producers, you can do it. It's going to be more expensive and it's going to cost you a lot of time. But if that's important to you, I have full respect for that.
Sure.
In those cases, if it's a quantity that you can like somehow actually transport back with you, then you should do that. I'm not sure if that's how small we're talking. If it's like a few bags, you can't transport that back with you easily. And you should, you need to talk again with an importer. You need to understand who they typically, like, are they already usually shipping coffee to your country? If not, you should start talking. This is another good reason to have good, strong relationships with importers. You need to be talking to an importer and say, hey, I'm looking at this coffee. They produce 30 bags. I'm thinking about buying 3 of them. Your importer might help you in that situation by buying the other 27. This is like, here we go again. Like, your competitors might have that coffees again.
Right. Right.
But that's, I mean, like, that's going to help you get those smaller quantities. But yeah, I mean, if you're just getting started, cup everything that your importer has, give them feedback, try to talk to as many importers as you can. And then when you're working directly with producers, again, talk to your importers. The sooner you talk to them, tell them before you're even traveling. They might know other farms in that area that you should visit, or other suppliers in that area who you should visit if you're traveling. Your importers are a great tool, and you should use them.
So I'm really curious about this. I've always been curious about this because I've never been a green buyer by trade. There's the marketing image of, oh, direct trade. We go down to meet the farmer. We know them. We buy their coffee direct, and magically the coffee goes from that farm to our roastery, almost like it was just sent by UPS, right?
Right.
And but what's the reality? I mean, it seems like after reading the book, it seems like, my God, there's importers, there's exporters, there's paperwork, there's corruption, there's getting booted to the back of the line because you're not a favorite customer at the mill. I don't know. Like, what's the reality of how complicated it really is, and how easy is it to really be following this quote unquote direct trade model, or how much of it is a little bit of like marketing spin? And so tell me a little bit about the reality, because it sounds hard.
So the origins of direct trade were a reaction to fair trade.
Sure.
So if you were working at a coffee shop, you know, before 2005, you got a lot of questions about whether or not your coffee was fair trade.
Hmm.
And it got tiring to keep responding with, yes. I mean, even when it's yes, it's like, well, yes, this like
Yeah.
one blend or coffee is, but these other ones aren't. And like, why aren't they all fair trade?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Why aren't you all organic? Why aren't you certified? Why aren't you fair trade? And
why don't
yeah,
you have
it's
all of the stickers?
exactly. Yeah.
Um, so it was around then that a few roasters I'm giving a very biased, localized picture, just to be clear, from the United
Sure.
States.
Sure.
That it was around then that Stumptown and Intelligentsia, primarily in my story, my version of this story, started to push this idea of direct trade. And there's like discussions about where it started.
Hmm.
Uh, there is no there's no recognized certifying body for direct trade. So good news, everyone out there. If you want to say your coffee is direct trade, you're right now in the clear. Even if it's not, there's nothing stopping you.
Right.
You might get called out, but that's about it. Um, the bad news is that means that there's yet another weird checkbox that you feel some responsibility to check, and you're not entirely sure what qualifies as direct trade or not. So direct trade, the roasters who are doing direct trade, you might believe that means that they're not using importers. I'm here to tell you they're using importers.
Right.
Direct trade means that they have a relationship with the coffee farm, and they usually negotiate the farm gate price directly with the coffee, the person or persons who can most be described as the coffee farmers.
Hmm.
Um, that's it. So
Sure.
I would strongly discourage you from thinking that it's much more involved than that, because it means that you might get yourself into trying to do logistical work that would, even if you were good at it, would just be so much effort and time on your part.
Hmm. So talk to me a little bit about the complexities of getting coffee milled and to the port and shipped and get all the paperwork done and get it all the way to your roastery, because that process really intimidates me. Recently, I helped a friend at Origin sell to a couple of roasters I work with, and there were a lot of problems and a lot of delays. And because the people involved were relatively new at that process, and there's always surprises. So tell me about the complexity and what really happens to your bags of coffee. How do they get here? It's who's involved?
So disappointing as it is, your question is my answer. It's every country is its own thing. So
Sure.
again, like this is why, and it's like, it's completely different in Guatemala than it is in Colombia, and it's much different than it is in Ethiopia. So in every country, from getting the coffee milled, from getting the coffee off the tree to getting it to your warehouse, it's following a different path. Sometimes, sometimes the farmer is also the processor and the dry mill. Sometimes the person, hands cherry off and never really thinks again about what happens to it.
Sure.
So, and I'll be honest, I've never gone down the rabbit hole of ever trying to take that on myself. I was always happy to leave it in the usually capable hands of the people who would do it on a regular basis. And
Sure.
I knew when something had gone wrong, and I learned some things around like it seems like coffee from earlier in the harvest moves out of the country a lot faster than coffee from the end of the harvest.
Sure.
And so I would start to have a bias towards coffees from earlier in the harvest, because something that would always the most disappointing experience as a coffee buyer in my view is tasting an amazing coffee and then it takes way too long to arrive to you.
Sure.
And it's, even if it still tastes good, it's disappointing because it shouldn't take that long. But then the other thing is that usually there'd be something wrong. There'd usually be something wrong with the coffee.
Yeah. I remember, I'm going to misquote you, but you had a quote in the book, something like, buying an 84 in April over an 86 in June, or something equivalent to that. Talk to me about that perspective, because I think that would, turn on a light bulb for some small roasters who haven't really thought of coffee that way.
Yeah. So I'll tell a brief story. In one year, I went to Guatemala in January, and it was at that time that was considered a little early, but the harvest was running a little bit early, and I cupped several tables. And typically, I was looking for 86 plus scoring coffees, and I cupped several that were 86 to 87s. I didn't really cup many like 88, 89s. I did later in that harvest because the later harvest usually brings on the better scores. But I knew, what I had to buy from Guatemala that year, and I said, I'm gonna buy half of my coffee right now at this time. And I talked to my importer, and it was like, this is great. This fills up a container. So we're gonna be able to send your coffee really fast. So I had fresh 86, 87 point Guatemalan coffee in my San Francisco roastery the first week of March, like going out to customers.
That's amazing. Amazing.
It was amazing. And if anything, they improved. And I remember talking closely with Steve Ford, who I was working with at that time. And just, we were both kind of appalled at how much better an experience that was than the experience where you are, you're cupping these just like gems in April or May, and then you receive them and they taste like skeletons in September.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think what I'm arguing for is the earlier you can move the coffee in the harvest, the more likely it is that you'll actually receive it in good time.
So is part of the problem that the dry mills just get backed up, and
yes,
the whole supply chain gets backed up, right? It's like,
yes,
early in the season, there's no one ahead of you in line, so everything moves quickly all the way to the port, all the way to you. It's great. But later in the season, you're last in line for everything to happen, and there's just every delay just backs you up even more, right?
Precisely.
Okay.
So if you're working with a farm who has their own dry mill, and this is fairly common in some countries, Guatemala is actually a good example, who has their own dry mill, then you can, if you're really specific, and if the producer's 100% on the same page with you about that coffee being able to move really fast, you can sometimes get it to work. But if you're not buying full containers, you're asking someone who's often not even the farmer, like they have a mill manager, you're asking them to stop running an efficient.
Right.
You're asking them, when they have a mountain of coffee outside, they have not enough patio space, or not enough, guardiolas, or not enough whatever. You're asking them to stop everything to move your 30, 40, even 100 bags. It's just like, they just don't want to do it. It's not, it's like they could be producing the best coffee, they could be the best people, and they might actually be making the right business decision for them too, which is really disappointing to hear.
Yeah.
But it's
Yeah.
just a reality of and these are like the kinds of things you just need to know that. But early in the year, before they have a mountain of coffee, they're much more likely to entertain
Sure.
your needs.
Sure. That makes total sense. This is just practical, you know.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so I want to touch back on something we were talking about, and I want to finish it off sort of. When it comes to small roasters and how they should ramp up their buying, a lot of times I've given vague advice to my clients, and I'd love you to critique my advice. I've said something like, don't try to buy direct from origin until you're using at least 1,000 pounds a week. Like use importers until then. Worry about getting good at roasting. Worry about getting good at cupping. Worry about running your cafe, getting your business off the ground. And then when you get to that 1,000 pounds a week, or maybe more, maybe 2,000 pounds a week, you say, okay, now it's worth paying someone, pay the travel expenses, go to Origin, do some cupping at Origin, attempt to form some relationships. Like there's not necessarily a huge hurry to do all that, and there's a lot to worry about when you start a new business. So I've sort of I've tried to convince my clients to transition very slowly into buying direct and not be in a huge hurry, and then find, let's say you're in the US, find an easy origin. Like maybe you can go to Mexico, it's very close, and maybe you speak some Spanish, and it's like an easy place to begin your exploration of buying direct. Like, does that seem like reasonable advice? Would you change any of that?
Um, I would never disagree with you publicly.
Please do.
No,
Please do.
I'm just kidding. I think so. I like it. The like yes and that I'll do is know why. If it's travel you want, fine.
Yeah.
You don't have to buy coffee to travel.
Definitely.
I know you all know that. But if you want to go visit your suppliers, talk to your importer and just say, hey, like we love this coffee we've been buying from you. We're going to travel to Mexico, and like can you help connect us? If your
Sure.
importer is unwilling to do that,
Yeah. Yeah.
that would be strange, and you should ask them about that, and then you should consider not working with them anymore as soon as you can. Um, but and if it's really that no, it's really important to us to buy coffee and negotiate the price directly with the producer. I think that's fine, and I mean, it could be 1,000 pounds, it could be 500, it could be 5,000. Like it's there. I wouldn't say there's any hard and fast rules on
Sure.
quantity. What I would definitely echo that you've said is, and echoing myself is, there's if you have several importers around you, and even if you only have one, they have long positions. You can learn a lot, and you can usually buy really great coffees from their list. And
Yeah.
then you can also go and meet with the producers of those coffees if you want to.
Sure.
But be a little bit more honest with yourself about what the need is. You do not need to travel to be a totally legit and also very effective, successful coffee buyer.
Totally. Connor here asks, what is your opinion on resting coffee in a bodega for around 2 months before shipping? Necessary or beneficial?
Um, so just to be clear, Connor, I'm assuming that Connor is asking, should a producer or a dry mill after or before milling, perhaps, should they rest the coffee after harvest before exporting? Is that what he said, or is that what he
Okay,
asked?
let's run with that because it
Okay.
wasn't clear. Yeah.
A lot. I I credit most poor arrivals, meaning when there's a slip in quality between the coffee as I cupped it, off the drying tables or off the patio, or a pre-ship to how it arrives in my where I am roasting the coffee. I attribute most drops in quality to unstable, let's just say unstable moisture or water activity. Um, so over time, Reposo has become this standard way of discussing letting the coffee rest. I mean, Reposo means rest or repose.
Hmm.
but it's really just if you really understand what's happening in drying, then Reposo is really just saying coffee wasn't really dry. And
Yeah.
again, it was because we had a mountain of coffee that we needed to dry, and we needed this patio space, and that coffee had already been there for
Right.
8 days. I mean, this is like it's a real thing, and it's like kind of silly. It seems silly a lot of times, but it's often like, no, we don't have more patio space. This is how much patio space we have, and
Yep.
when more coffee is coming in, we have to make way for it. So we'll look at the one that's close enough to being finished and we'll remove it. And it's not really ready. And the moisture is variable in different samples from that coffee.
Hmm.
So will it improve it? Maybe. Ideally, though, when you're done with the drying, you're done with the drying. And the huge risk, the like for me, the elephant in the room is the elephant in the room when it comes to bodegas and storing the coffee and rest is that the country of origin is typically they have a dry season when there's a harvest and then there's a wet season immediately afterwards. And so that the relative humidity goes way up and that is bad for coffee that's not protected. So this is yet another reason why buying early in a harvest often is like a better predictor of arrival quality. It's because coffee that's sitting out in a humid country or very often at an even more humid port, because the coffee doesn't necessarily hang out at the farm. It usually goes to, like somewhere near the ocean,
Hmm.
um, is just extremely risky.
Right. Okay. Um, I mean, is there a theory that maybe if the drying was done a little too quickly, that Reposo will even out the moisture distribution within the beans?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. I mean, you could probably provide a great analogy with roasting. If you dry really fast, you'll have pockets of drier and you'll have pockets of
Yeah.
wetter, and you're
Yeah.
hoping that it will homogenize.
Right.
And especially patios and guardiolas do this. Patios seem very, I don't know, natural or something, but they
Hmm.
can get extremely hot, and there can be hot spots for sure. And then also, kind of like they have to cover them up and kind of try to protect them at night, because with that heat, there's like a drop, and then you get condensation, and so like
Yeah.
it's it can patio dried coffee can be fantastic, and then also it can have problems with lack of homogeneity
Hmm.
in the dryness in the
Okay.
moisture content.
Cool. Um, okay. Switching gears. Are there any disease-resistant hybrids you've found very good in the cup?
I was almost tricked on one once. No, the answer is no. The answer is no, and I'm sad to say no, and of
Yeah.
course I'll,
Yeah.
I'll elaborate on why. The answer is no. In my experience, I remember one in particular that had amazing fragrance. I mean, it was floral. It had nice fruit. Really great aroma in the cup. It was delicious, sweet. On the first pass, on the second pass, it was kind of like, that's weird. Um, and then on the final pass, it was just like, oh, that's neither sweet, and it's a little bit vegetal and it's dry. And that was the best I ever had. And I think I scored it an 84. So I just want to be clear, like I think that it will happen.
Hmm.
It hasn't happened for me yet. The best I ever had was I would have scored an 84. The worst, I don't know, in the 70s or something. Um, but of course we need that, because I'm afraid that the decision is essentially in the future between hybrids or no coffee. So
Yeah.
I think our unwillingness as a species to deal with climate is going to force that choice.
Well, we may not last long enough for it to matter, so it's okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
let's talk about that.
Yeah. Yeah. With the election coming up, great. Um, all right. I'm not sure what to make of this question, but I think you will. Do you believe farm gate prices should be based on cup scores?
I'm just going to make this simple and say yes.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
you need to make, and also I want to point out that means that means so like, should you pay more for an 87.5 than an 87? Maybe. Should you not buy an 85 but buy an 86? Maybe. I think you need to decide. I'm not saying they should be rigidly tied, but I think it makes sense to base them on. And I'll give a couple reasons. Even if you don't charge your customers differently for higher quality or higher priced coffees, even if you don't do that,
Hmm.
the fact of the matter is that when a coffee producer, this kind of intentionality that we talked about earlier, that there are decisions, and those decisions that a coffee producer can make to improve the quality of their coffee. And when they do, they cost money and they cost time and they cost effort. So it makes sense to me that you would pay more for that, because that's what they're hoping. They're hoping, I'm going to take these steps that will cost more money and cost more time, and I'm hoping that I get paid more for this coffee as a consequence of that.
Sure.
So yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Good. I'm glad you said that.
I hope that's not a
Um,
gotcha.
no, no, no. I was right with you there. So, all right. So, this could be a kind of a funny thing to talk about, but I love the part in the book where you talk about when to give advice to suppliers. In other words, basically when not to give advice to suppliers, because the implication was that a lot of people kind of get a little bit experience in green coffee buying and then go to a few different farms or mills and start dishing out advice. So tell me about that dynamic, because I think it's important for all of us in places like the US to understand the dynamic and what our role is here.
Yeah, you know, when I asked earlier to like think about some of your best customers, you probably didn't think of someone who's always telling you how to run your business differently. I'm guessing. I'm sure that if you do think about them, they probably have really helpful ways to guide you to make decisions that are better for them and also better for you.
Mhm.
I I don't want to discount a lot of the work done in, let's say, consuming countries to help educate and illuminate everyone in coffee about how we can make this product better, make coffee better.
Mhm.
The effort and work of experts who, experts in any part of production or processing or milling, um, is not the same as kind of us coffee buyers going and telling people and kind of potentially getting them into a hole that they can't dig themselves out of.
Sure.
So yeah, I think if you're not an expert in agronomy or processing, and by expert I mean like you probably have a degree in it,
Right.
or
Right.
effectively a degree, and I'll accept the University of Arizona. But you should probably be an expert in the field, in that particular field. Um, it, and if you're not, then like you should probably be either buying the coffee very frequently, committed to buying any failed experiments, and like
Mm.
that's going to be a deal breaker for most people.
Yeah.
No, no,
You
no, we
got
want you to do the experiment, but then we're
right.
not
Right.
going to.
Right.
No, we can't buy. Yeah,
You got to take on some of the risk. Absolutely.
you have to take on some of the risk. But also, I think it's fine to share the information without encouraging or advising. So I want to be clear about that too. I think there's interesting stuff happening, and you know, part of the long lasting healthy relationship is we both love coffee. And we both like to talk about what we're learning in coffee together. And I think it's great to share that information,
Hmm.
and just and then just ask them what they think about it, and actually listen.
Right.
So I think that's the key, is that if it's really a partnership, then part of what it is you are their customer and you're not trying to change what it is that they offer. You're there to buy their coffee.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the elephant in the room here is you don't want to be the condescending slash imperialistic first world rich person kind of going to Origin and telling people what to do because you have this complex, basically.
You said it. You said the
I
word.
did. I think it had to be said. Sorry.
Scott was very insistent in our chat about this that he wanted me to say something about don't be an imperialist.
Yes, because that's my favorite line in the book.
Don't be an imperialist.
Um, tell me about the 3-6-12 approach, because I think this is one of the great practical pieces of advice in the book that all roasters should be aware of, and that newer roasters really need to understand stuff like this. This is the
Okay.
nuts and bolts.
It came from my not only my failure, but my repeated failure. So just give yourself a break. Forecasting is, I think, it's like one of the basic jobs, and it feels like it's just a simple math problem, but it's like a little bit more than that. And part of it is there's a lot of emotions involved in it. If you're like constantly cupping and your job is to find the good ones, it's really easy to accidentally buy too much.
Sure.
Also, if you are working with other people, especially if you're the coffee buyer and like you're not also kind of responsible for growth, you might be thinking like, oh, like I'm hearing we're going to open new cafes, we're going to get a new customer. And you start going like, well, if this is true, and like if they even do half of what we're predicting they're going to do, we're going to need at least this much more coffee.
Mm-hmm.
And in those moments in particular, I would strongly encourage you to just stop and just never buy more coffee than you are currently consuming. So now there's a startup problem here. If you're literally, well, I'm starting my roastery today. Well,
Sure.
yeah, you're going to have to buy something, but assume that whatever your, cafes or customers bought last week is probably what they're going to buy this week and probably what they're going to buy next week. And that will continue, forever. The reason that you should assume this is that it's so much easier to correct the problem of underbuying than it is to correct the problem of overbuying. Because there's so many people who want to sell you coffee, but when you have too much of it and it starts to get bad, no one is going to want to take it off your hands, and it's just demoralizing. So what I propose in Dear Coffee Buyer is essentially a tiered method, and I call it 3-6-12, and the idea is you should have available, and by available I don't mean necessarily at your roastery, but at your roastery / locally available in a warehouse, like your importer's warehouse, for example, about 3 months worth of your coffee consumption. So if you roast 1,000 pounds, that means about 13,000 pounds. You should, when you look at the coffees arriving over the next, 6 months, they should represent you should also know kind of like the next 6 months worth of your coffee. And you should know if that is like a little bit more or a little bit less than 6 months worth of consumption.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, you should always also be planning out your next 12 months worth of purchases. So, most origins have annual harvests. And so you should be working with suppliers. When you're working with suppliers at origin, you should be working with suppliers at origin to get your needs. If you're not working with them, you should also be talking to importers and telling them what you expect to buy from the Guatemalan harvest in 12 months.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I use 3-6-12 if you use 2-5-15, it doesn't matter. I think what's important is that you have these tiers of what can I get, by tomorrow,
Mm-hmm.
what's coming in the next several months, and then like how am I planning out for a year away from now?
Sure. I think you've touched upon this, but I want to emphasize it. One of the big things I learned from the book, it is so much better to run out of coffee and be forced to buy a little coffee spot than it is to be sitting on overbought amounts of coffee that gets older and older and older, and you're desperate to get rid of it. Like that is the worst position to be in. And buying spot is no big deal.
It's not.
Buying spot is great because there's so little risk. Because if some importer in your country has that coffee sitting there in his warehouse and you get a sample of it, there's no risk that it's going to spoil by the time it gets to you. There's no risk there's going to be some new fade on the coffee. It's like exactly what you're getting. Yeah, you're paying a little more for it, but great. Like that's wonderful. Like you've just paid a little more to get rid of risk. There's no harm in that.
It's cherry picking. I would pay more for that every day because
Sure.
In my experience, I remember the dogs much more than I remember the gems, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And it's partially because the gems go like that. and they're gone in a
Totally,
minute, and
totally.
the dogs last forever.
Yeah.
So
And they force a lot of decision making. It's like, oh, now we got to put this in a blend, and and it gets older and older, and it's just like you start feeling bad. Like you feel like as a barista or as a roaster, I used to feel just bad about myself knowing that I was serving something that I just had to get rid of that wasn't what I wanted to represent.
it's the
It's
worst.
demoralizing. Yeah. Yeah, it's
It's
terrible.
so bad.
So I know we said we're not gonna have some extensive conversations about fermentation because it's I think fermentation's become such a big issue. It's very complex. There's a lot of change going on in there. But talk to me a little bit about your perspective on what's going on with fermentation, and we can draw the line on how much you want to talk about it.
Well, yeah, so I'm definitely not an expert in this topic. What I will say is I'm excited about the work being done there.
Hmm.
I'm what what I've seen is would still mostly qualify as like anecdotal, which doesn't mean that experiments aren't being run. It just means that they're not being run at a level that I would call statistically significant yet.
Sure, sure.
But I'm going to repeat the last point again, just to be clear. I'm excited about the work because, for example, if there are ways that we can help coffee, help ensure that coffee can last green coffee can last longer, of course, I'm all for that.
Yep.
Um, but yeah, I think that in the coming years, we will have more sort of conclusive recommendations and suggestions that will be in a good place to start to broadcast widely to processors across the world.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean it's clear we're getting there. It's clear that using certain microbes or certain conditions during fermentation
Oh, Scott,
having
or
great effects on the longevity of coffee and slowing down fade and things like that, which is wonderful.
yeah, yeah. Oh, I mean that's again like when it comes to getting rid of the dogs, like that's
Yeah,
wonderful news.
yeah. So, in your time with Tonks and Blue Bottle and such, um, you know, if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, but your job shifted from purely being a green buyer to doing a fair amount of marketing or other managerial tasks. Somebody asked the question. I'm not really sure what to make of it, but answer it as you wish. How does marketing interact with green sourcing?
Yeah. I mean, in all of my coffee buying roles, I had an integral voice in how we talked about not just our green coffee, but our relationships with coffee producers,
Mm.
how we roasted or why we roasted the way that we roasted. Um, and probably, because this third wave of coffee is about terroir and the producer, this is not really that surprising.
Hmm.
Um, so, something that I want to spend more time thinking about and sharing is I think there's a lot more to say about storytelling in coffee. And I'm seeing everyone kind of converge in a certain direction about how we present our coffees.
Sure.
And I'm worried that that is reducing, that you all have potentially more interesting different ways to talk about why it is that you love coffee, what brought you here, and what it is that you do differently.
Hmm.
So how does marketing interact with green sourcing? I mean, it's a big part of describing essentially, why the coffee tastes the way it does, why you roast it the way it does, um, what your relationships, like how you have a relationship with a producer, So yeah, I hope that answers the question for
Okay,
that person.
sure. Well, it was a pretty general question, so I think anything's legit. Um, this could be a tough one, or it could be easy, but somebody asked, "Have you changed your mind about anything since writing the book?"
Again, like storytelling, I think is a big one. Um, when I wrote the book, I I kind of ethically believed that the right way to sell coffee was by the farm or producer name. I don't
Hmm.
feel that way anymore.
Hmm. Okay.
And I'll tell you why. I don't think it's serving the customer.
Yep.
I'm worried if the customer feels alienated. And I believe that every coffee company out there would say that they're thinking about their customer, but I believe in reality, they're the lowest on the kind of like the lowest in consideration. And this is weird for me to hear myself saying just because of what I did to coffee in the mid aughts,
Hmm.
or the role that I took in that. Um, the biggest opportunity, if I were starting a coffee company now, the biggest opportunity I think is not marketing and selling your coffee the the way that everybody else does. And I'm seeing I mean, like, Starbucks is on board now with farm names. So just like, I want
Yeah.
to ask you, do you really, I'm not saying that you shouldn't do it that way. I'm just saying, can you think of another way?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, look, we see this herd mentality with everything in coffee and other industries where someone comes up with an idea like, "Hey, we're going to call it direct trade," and then suddenly these words get thrown around, and everyone's got the same story of we scour the world to find the best coffees, and we do this and we do that, and everybody kind of sounds the same, and it's but it's I don't think it's that hard to be original. I think it just takes guts to say, you know what, this is our thing, and we're going to say it even if nobody else is saying it.
Exactly. Yeah, I want to give everyone the you can blame me, especially if it doesn't work out. Do things differently than your competitors.
Yeah.
It makes it a lot easier to share your coffee with them if you just like market the coffee differently or sell it differently. Um, be willing to do things different and not more legit or more cool or more the way you're supposed to do it. Like, look at some of the things that you think of as rules and ask yourself, what if I broke this rule? What would that mean? What would happen?
Hmm.
Would the world end? And this is the other thing too. If it doesn't work, what's great is that you can always fall back and be like, oh, we're just going to do it the conventional way.
Totally.
And
Totally.
I also wouldn't try to reinvent the wheel on everything, but pick the few areas where you look at it and you're just like, everyone in the industry does it this way. I don't know why, and it seems like we should do it this totally different way, and run with it.
Yep.
See what happens. Learn something.
Yeah. Yeah, take a little risk. It's not like yeah. It's and I see falling back on the old way when necessary as just it's sort of like running out of coffee and buying spot. It's like it's not so bad. Not so bad to just go back to the standard marketing if you have to.
On that, by the way, I meant to say, I know, like, if you think of the big direct trade players, they all buy spot coffee.
Yeah.
I would, I traveled half the year at Stumptown, and then when I was in town, I always was cupping spot coffees for the espresso blend, like
Hmm.
always. Like, we were buying, containers of spot coffee,
Yeah.
and containers of direct trade coffee. So
Yeah.
it's not either or.
No, I mean business logistics are messy.
Yeah.
Coffee's late, or you grew faster than you thought, or things go wrong, and you got to fill in gaps, and that's just reality.
Yeah.
All right, so we've got about 4 minutes left. I was kind of thinking about
Mm.
asking you. You had a couple of stories in the book that I really liked, and I'd love to hear the stories from you. Like one story was when you hadn't really traveled to Origin yet, but Dwayne from Stumptown was in San Francisco, and just on a whim, you ended up traveling with him to, I think, Honduras, and you cupped
Yeah.
like 140 coffees in less than 24 hours and went back to San Francisco. And there's the story of you kind of working with a farmer, I think in Guatemala, to really kind of push him towards day lot sampling and how excited you were and how that evolved over time. Like, tell me one of those stories because that's part of what I really loved about the book.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell the Dwayne one for a second. Dwayne is the founder of Stumptown, and Ritual was an early customer of Stumptown. So when Ritual opened, we had roasted coffee shipped down to San Francisco from Portland. And Dwayne would frequently stop in to get a shot of espresso. And on one particular day, I served him a shot, and he told me that he was going to Honduras that later that evening. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. And after my shift, as one does, because you've been drinking coffee all morning, I needed to drink a large amount of alcohol to counteract my morning, and ran into him at his and my favorite Mexican restaurant down the street from Ritual. And several pitchers of margarita later, he, in his very Dwayne way, was like, "Hey, man, do you want to go to Honduras with me tonight?" And to this day, I'm not sure if he was like trying to call my bluff or something, but I like quickly texted the owner of Ritual, Eileen Hassey, and she was like, "Yeah, do it." Um, and so, yeah, that was my very first trip to a coffee origin. It was my first trip to a coffee farm. It happened, I like ran home and I like threw all my stuff into my messenger bag. Had a very blank passport, and fortunately I had a passport, and like went to Honduras with Dwayne. And yeah, just like got off the plane into San Pedro Sula. It's extremely hot, and we just kept table after table after table after table. And that experience was huge for me. Like being able to cup with Dwayne, who was an incredible, I don't know that he's not anymore, but certainly at that time was an incredible cupper. And
Sure.
getting to hear how he reacted to these day lots was really cool. Getting to see what he did with his selections, like putting them into blends, picking some as micro lots. This was like, he gave me so much in that trip. But yeah, we cupped, I think 70 to 80 samples that day. And then we like cupped the top 20 the next day. And then I got to go visit a coffee farm, and it was Finca del Puente, the Caballeros, which are just like the sweetest people who are incredible coffee producers. You see their coffee often marketed as Caballeros.
Hmm.
Um, and I think it was also on that trip that Dwayne delivered to them geisha seed.
Oh, wow.
And they went on to produce geisha, and their geisha is just incredible. Like some of the probably the best that I've ever cupped.
Amazing.
Um,
So
so
I'm gonna interrupt you because we're gonna get cut off in the next few seconds. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for your expertise. It was really nice to talk to you.
anytime, Scott.
All right, and thanks everybody for tuning in. We really hope you enjoyed this. All
Bye
right,
bye.
have a great day, everyone.